Before we get started on our program, I want to acknowledge the ongoing action in response to racial violence. We stand with those struggling for justice and recognize the injustice of racism in the United States. Art is important and brings us together. As a commitment to our continued diversity, equity, access, and inclusion work here at CSM, we are in conversation about how we can actively listen, learn, and grow with our community. As a small example of our solidarity, we have started setting up protest sign-making stations to support and have opened our outdoor space for all protesters that need a safe space. We are working directly with local organizers and hope to continue supporting them in their work. The museum's proximity to Civic Center Park allows us to serve our community in these direct ways, and we will strive to find additional ways to contribute to the Black Lives Matter movement. This afternoon, the Clyfford Still Museum's Director, Dean Sobel, will lead us on a 45-minute virtual tour of the secret depths of CSM's painting storage vaults. This is a program that Dean has wanted to do for a long time, and we're excited to present this in an online format. So most of you already have the pleasure of knowing Dean Sobel, CSM Director since 2005. Sobel is presently finishing a major exhibition on Still's late works, planned to open in September 2020. Thank you for joining us today, Dean. I am going to hand it over to you.
Hello, everybody. Can you hear me and see me okay? I am standing in the South Painting Storage of the Clyfford Still Museum. My own little housekeeping things. First of all, I want to thank the staff for putting this together. I want you to know this entire program is being broadcast from an iPhone and our laptop. So if you experience any audio or video problems, we will get them rectified right away. But this is kind of fun to do it in such a homespun, more or less low-tech sort of way. As I mentioned, we are in by far the most secure space at the museum. No one has entered in here, and it's very, very fun to be able to share it with you virtually, because it's something we wouldn't be able to do in a more traditional fashion. You may know we also have a second storage room. You probably guessed it's called North Painting Storage. We'll be devoting our time only to this room, where a collection of works from probably the last 25 years of Still's career are housed. And so the basis of a lot of my remarks this afternoon will really be towards somewhat more recent works, things after 1955 at least. You might be interested to know that in this storage room, if my count was correct from our database, we have about 306 paintings in this one room. So it's packed very high densely and very efficiently, and not necessarily set up to be shown in the way we're doing it today. But we're going to do 5 stops, and as Nicole mentioned, we would encourage any questions on almost any topic that you have along the way. And the first stop is a picture that may be familiar to you. It's PH 1187 from 1956. It was one of the cover images and one of the main images we used for an exhibition we did probably 5 years ago called Repeat, Recreate. And this group of paintings is a very, very interesting and actually a kind of long story. One of the versions of this picture exists at the Modern Art Museum of Fort Worth that we borrowed for our exhibition. It was paired with another example of this picture, almost identical composition that I don't have to show you today. But probably 18 months ago or so, when we were doing some of our unrolling for the collections, with the collections team, we discovered a third version of this painting, which was rather remarkable. So we own 2 versions of this in-house. And if we ever need to show those 2, we could just simply come down to the storeroom and grab them. But what we've learned from our research, and this is not uncommon with Still's practice of making what he called replicas, is when the picture was sold, the first version was sold to the collector who eventually gifted it to the Modern Art Museum in Fort Worth. He made another example. And then there was a collector who was interested in acquiring that. And so a third example was made. I believe this is the third example of the 3. But that collector, who was actually based in Europe, had the picture shipped to him. And believe it or not, it wouldn't fit in his collection, in his home, physically. So it was returned to Still. where the two versions remained until his death, and then both versions were transferred here. So it's kind of remarkable to have in those instances two images of essentially the same composition. It's a very, very strong example of what would be a masterpiece of abstract expressionism, somewhat typical of his work in the mid-1950s. One of the things that I'm always struck by in these pictures is the asymmetry in the picture. A lot of the activity sort of happens seemingly on the right side of the painting, but somehow, and in all cases, still makes it work. The entire composition is in balance and is very successful at revealing itself as a single image. The intensities of the yellows, which you can't see probably so well from your home computer, is pretty remarkable, and I used yellows intentionally. There's probably 2 or 3 different yellow passages, and then little bits and highlights, the yellow creeping in from what would be my right side, passages of bare canvas, and then this incredible black form. Sometimes we think of these even as black suns. I'll bring this up again in a few minutes, but these very dramatic right hand black form that does tend to hold the whole picture in balance. But again, I want you to think of this image when we start to look at the next 4 images, because what will happen is Still's work will change pretty significantly and pretty dramatically after he moves to Maryland in 1961. So I'll pull this one back. These racks move very easily. I can do it with one finger. How's that?
There's just one little move we have to make, but as we're going through the program today, feel free to add questions in the chat and I can pass them over to Dean as we go.
As a little bit of background, and again, as members, I think many of you know this, Clyfford and his wife, Patricia, made the decision to move to Maryland in mid-1961. This painting is actually dated from 1963. Still had to clear out his barn on the property in order to turn it into a studio. Very little work was made in Maryland in 1961, and very little work was made the following year in 1962. Probably only a handful of paintings, maybe 8 or 10. So this really represents the beginnings of his practice in Maryland. And I think you can see it is probably one of the most reductive, one of the most austere paintings we have in the collection. When we were starting to unroll the canvases, I was never incredibly drawn to these images, but as we've been doing the work for the late works exhibition, you will see in the first room when we open that show, hopefully in September, you will see a whole group of these that express to me a kind of very elemental, very basic restart. The image consists of bare canvas primarily, this black form, which I'll also refer to as a kind of black sun anytime we see these very round, sometimes more oval forms, and then a companion red, very heavily encrusted red form that you probably can't see so well. There's something about these images, and we'll have 3 or 4 more in the first room, that to me really do read as a kind of starting over. And particularly when you think of it in the context of the image we just saw, the yellow picture, it's almost that he's very tentatively putting forms down, adding a second one, and trying to rebuild up from this point as he starts to understand how he'll continue his career, which by the early 60s was going gangbusters. All the abstract expressionists were becoming internationally famous. And I do think there's something about clearing the deck, if you will, or what actors call going to zero, to sort of start over again. The next images will all build, I think, from this basic experimentation that he did in 1962 and 1963. As the late work show will show, a number of really important things start to happen in the late 60s and into the 70s. He certainly starts to regain some of his fury and fire that we think of in his classic abstract expressionist work. But he tries out a number of new compositions. This is actually a painting from 1973 that doesn't easily link up with the columnar vertical forms we think of the classic late 1950s murals, or even the yellow picture, also from the mid-1950s. It's built up of these rather evocative, very carefully considered black forms and the blue ones set in. with white highlights articulating each one. It has this kind of romantic landscape quality about it, as if there's a source of light coming in from the back and tinging each of those forms with a little bit of highlight color. His characteristic lifeline is coming down from the top, but very, very selective, and another paired lifeline in a kind of yellow on the right-hand side. But this is a painting that is, in my view, unmistakably Clyfford Still, but there's really no precedent for it in the career before this point. It's a much flatter picture, and again, introduces a kind of compositional arrangement that we really don't see in Still's work until the 1970s. The other thing that I just wanted to mention to you, it certainly is also a fusion of two of Still's colors that he uses throughout his whole career. This blue is not so far off from the big blue painting that we show constantly at the museum. And then, of course, black and white are colors that he uses extensively as well. About 3 years ago, the American artist Glenn Ligon was asked to curate an exhibition at the Pulitzer Foundation in St. Louis. And he based his whole exhibition from the Pulitzer's collection around the colors of black and blue. And it's interesting, had he been able to borrow this picture, it would have been a very interesting addition. Ligon was very much inspired by the Louis Armstrong cover of the Fats Waller jazz standard that has that refrain, "What did I do to become so black and blue?" That in the context, I think, of today's really, kind of horrible situation we find ourselves in, and I think those of us are looking at this picture in a very different way. The way we think of black and blue as being a bruise or some sort of wound is something that I would ask you to consider as we're looking at it in this context today.
I have a question.
Yes, a question.
Dean, I have a question. Susan wants to know, is the white painted or is it plain canvas?
The question is it a white paint or bare canvas? And almost in all cases, it's a combination of both in these instances. He never fills in the bare canvas completely. So for example, this is white paint, but it's shadowed to the left by bare. The fact that a lot of these colors and forms never lock up completely, they're not hard edged, to use a term we use for thinking of abstraction in the 1960s by a more formal group of artists. In this case, it's actually a combination of both bare, white, bare and white. So I think Still thinks of those things as being different. Bareness and painted white each have their own temperature and their own expressive quality. So again, I think it's a really good question. It's something you wouldn't be able to tell until we can let you in and look at these paintings ourselves. I should mention we are safe distanced here in today's program. I'm not wearing a mask, I have one. The small number of staff members are all masked up as well. So we're doing this safely and hopefully comfortably for you all.
Thanks for that question, Susan. We're just pulling back another layer of racks for our next painting.
Again, as I keep mentioning, there are a lot of things to look for in Still's Maryland work. And one of them that is very profound and I think very noticeable, and certainly something that you'll see a great deal of in the exhibition in the fall, is Still starts to introduce slopes and diagonals and exaggerates his forms. Things that we detected in the earlier work become bigger and bolder and more energetic. And I think this is a very, very good example of that, where the element from the upper right corner comes almost crashing down in a very expressive way to meet this competing and somewhat equally dramatic image coming in from the left-hand side. As much as we think of Still's work in the context of figuration and the human spirit, there are qualities, no question about it, and I think certainly in the later work, that do read as based in nature or based in something that resembles nature. That's probably a more accurate way to describe it. But this is really quite atypical of his work before the Maryland period. If you saw any kind of sense of motion, it would be a very quiet or still or very subtle motion where the drama gets keyed up very, very significantly in the 1970s especially. Another point I'll make about this painting, and hopefully you can see it fairly well, is the way in which his palette starts to broaden as well. Browns and ochres and earth tones, siennas and umbers, those sorts of things become very common color choices. As much as he used that early in his career, they become much more prevalent in the 1970s especially. And then a certain brightness, his reds and oranges and reds. Even this red is read that he probably wouldn't have considered using in the 1940s, late 1940s or 50s. But hopefully you can see that broader range of palettes, and even the ways that the lifelines are expressed in, from right to left: yellow, blue, green, and then this red-orange one that goes from the top to bottom.
I have a question.
We have another question.
Yeah. So a couple questions, actually. We want to know if this is PH 931.
I have my notes somewhere.
Pop quiz, Dean. And then another question about unrolling.
Yes, that is PH 931.
Okay, great.
Gold star, whoever did that.
And then that was Bailey. And you talk about unrolling. Does storing the canvases rolled harm them given the thick application of paint?
Can they hear the question? Did they hear you read it? Yeah. The rolling is a really, really interesting question. In some cases, it was very good to have the paintings rolled for 40, 50, 60 years. They weren't shown. They didn't have dust, or particularly they weren't traveled and exposed to some of the physical elements of movement and touching if they're in public collections. But at the same time, the rolling didn't allow the canvases to dry properly. And I think that figures in some of the condition problems that we see today. You wouldn't be able to see it on your side. By a close colleague, James Squires, is here with me masked up, but he could do a much better job of even elucidating some of the condition problems that in some cases are reversible, but certainly are things that are challenging us, particularly in the later work, as we're starting to make them accessible for the exhibition in the fall. So another good question.
We have another question that Colleen says the lifeline is at an angle here. Is that typical of his time in Maryland?
Yeah, that's another very astute observation. I think we'll see it again in the last stop. There's no question that experimentation and variety enter into that period in Still's work. We do see some lifelines arcing in the 1940s, especially lines that start to veer towards horizontal or more 45-degree angles. But it becomes much more prevalent in the Maryland period. Not only these forms that are coming in from the corners, but also the lifelines become more activated. In some cases, they become more swollen and bold, but all of those are experimented with and played upon during the Maryland period. But he was very prolific, about 375 paintings during that time.
And we have a question from Joseph. Why do you suppose some of his color choices shifted? Was it symbolic of the times, or just living in Maryland, or his age? Something else?
Boy, that's a really good question. You know, it's certainly not uncommon for Still to have used some of these colors earlier in his career, but I think at a certain point he wanted to let them have, you know, room to move or room to grow. So I think it's part of that tendency toward experimentation. Abstract expressionism was probably a fairly limiting movement. Not that he would have been aware of that at the time, but there are very specific characteristics that we assign to those paintings. And I think freedom and variety were absolutely governing principles of what he was doing. And I would think those color choices were more a function of that. It's just trying new things and seeing if it worked. And in some cases, you know, we have pink paintings and strange green. Some of them didn't work so well. You don't see them as commonly, but in the case of this, the ochres he would use quite regularly, almost up to the end. This is a painting that may be very familiar to you. It's a painting we've shown, you know, a good 6 or 8 times, probably since our opening in 2011. In doing some research for the late work exhibition, I found a letter that Still had written to a friend, an old friend, someone he met in the 1940s. And it was written in early 1979, January of 1979, where he said he had just made what he believed were some of the best paintings he had ever made. And it's pretty certain to me that this painting, which was made very, very late in 1978, that this is one of the paintings that he was referring to. You probably know that Still died in 1980, but we have no paintings dating from 1980. The final works actually are all from 1979, and I believe more or less, this is PH 1090, and PH 1098 is the last painting. I believe for all intents and purposes, this was among the last 10 paintings he ever made. It's a painting that he signed and dedicated to his wife, Patricia. Many of you have seen this inscription in the exhibition in pencil. It reads, "To my wife, Patricia, December 25th, 1978. So we made it and gave it to her for a Christmas present. And I think, if anything, this is probably a terrific example of what we see in Still's late work. I count probably 9 or 10 different colors: blue, greens, 2 different yellows, 2 different reds, 1 more maroon and 1 more orange red, another kind of purplish maroon. That shows you how, in fact, he reveled in this idea of having a broader color palette. What might be a more cursory, a looser paint handling, which I think also is a hallmark of Still's later work. What is interesting to me about this picture is it seems to be a reconciliation, a marriage of the classic, more rigid, formal, totemic forms that we see, say, in the 1950s, but done in a broader palette and this looser, more cursory paint handling that I think sort of ends still at a very, very strong note, that he sort of ends where he was beginning as he was developing his now signature abstract expressions. Yes.
We have a couple questions in the chat right now. The first is from Paul, and he wants to know, are many of the paintings still rolled up, or how are they stored other than being hung?
That's a good question. We announced, I think it was about 18 months ago, that we had finished our inventory, which means we had unrolled everything and documented it, remeasured it, done some very rough condition notes, probably did a loose photograph of it so we would have something as a record there. But many paintings, and probably in the neighborhood of 200, 220, are still not stretched. They're still rolled. A number are being stretched as we speak. Even during our complete closure, we've been, James and his team have been doing some stretching, but I think I'm pretty close in that number. Just over 200 paintings are still rolled. And that will take some time as we work around other demands and other treatments that the conservation team needs to do, but we'll get to them eventually, and it will be a momentous occasion when we get them all stretched.
Great. And a question from Steve. I guess I'm not up to speed on his compositional techniques. If time permits, can you elaborate on the lifeline feature?
I'm trying to think what's the best example of a lifeline in this picture. We probably don't have it quite as well, but what I think most people detect when they walk through the galleries, or at least the abstract galleries, but I think certainly you see it in the grain elevators, the puffs of smoke, the strong, upright, rigid figures you would see in the 1930s. Still really loved placing tight vertical forms, and oftentimes in horizontal compositions, both in his representational work and his abstract work. And later in his life, around the 1970s, he gave us a very important clue and actually called the more sinewy, more delicate forms rising vertically, he called them lifelines. And I think he was doing that to suggest that those forms, vertical, and here's another example of one that's a little more swollen and vibrant, those forms are representative of a life force. He would tell you that when you're alive, you walk through the landscape vertically, and when you die, you go horizontal. And so that simple language, almost a kind of motif or a leitmotif in his work that defines verticality as being symbolic of you and me, the forces that keep us upright, tends to permeate almost all of his work. And so while we don't have the more delicate lifelines, we have things that are connecting the top and the bottom of the canvas, or partially connecting the top and bottom quite significantly in this work. And almost always something rising up from the bottom and something else coming down from the top. But that lifeline is something when we reopen, you'll be able to see, I think, pretty easily when you know what to look for. Any other questions? How are we doing on time? I will say something about our reopening. As some of you may know, you just can't reopen at your convenience. You have to do it within the requirements of state and local governments. All of the museums are working on the plans and the requirements necessary to reopen. We're looking around the very first part of July. That may be off by a day or a week or two, but we are ready and waiting to bring you back in. The only thing we need to do is make sure that we do it within the proper government approvals. So you'll be allowed to buy tickets online. We'll reduce the number of visitors, and it will be, I think, very safe and something we're looking forward to as much as you are, I hope. Hey, thank you for joining us. Thanks for the team that put it together. I think our iPhone held out remarkably. And again, stay safe, be well, and we can't wait to welcome you at the museum. So keep watching our social media and websites for announcements, but we'll see you in the galleries very, very soon. Cheers, have a nice day.
Thanks so much for joining us and have a great day.